Thank you. I apologize. I'm stranded in the English language, but that doesn't reflect a lack of commitment to Europe, in case I feel the need to say that. No one is a more passionate Remainer than I am, and the terrible Brexiteers in the UK that are destroying our relationship with friendship, collegiality, joint action. I mean, I shouldn't go on about Brexit, but the fact that I'm here, what we do is we share. National boundaries are no barrier to sharing knowledge, understanding, and working together. That's what I do in my day job. How could I be other than a passionate European? So I apologize for the mess in my country. A young member of my family asked me, "Is anyone listening to you?" And I thought, this young man's got a good future. He knows how to ask the right question. He said, "Is anyone taking you seriously?" And in a way, the Healthy City Network was taking me seriously before I was talking. So healthy cities are my natural partners, and as I will say a little way into my talk, we have a small number of cities within the Healthy Cities Network who've declared themselves Marmot cities. And perhaps we can think about that a little bit more. But in response to my young relative who asked, "Is anyone listening to you?" I published my book, The Health Gap, the first line of which was, why treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick? When most people outside this room, not in this room, but when most people outside this room think about health, they think about health care. Ministers of health think about health care. And people who have responsibility for health. When the OECD talks about investing in health, they don't mean investing in health, they mean investing in health care. And so the opening line of my book was, why treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick? I was asked recently by the Minister of Health in Italy, a good question, what proportion of the health of the population could be attributed to health care? My budget, she said, and how much to other things? I said, good question, difficult to answer it. Don Berwick, leading healthcare researcher in the United States, got hold of my book, and he tried to do some calculations, and he came up with maybe 20% of the health of the population is healthcare, and the other 80% is social determinants of health. And she, Giulia Grillo, the Minister of Health in Italy, I shouldn't say this, but when she asked for my advice, I asked my Italian colleagues, how long do ministers of health last? How long will she be there? But I shouldn't say that. She then said, well, what do I do as Minister of Health? And I said, your role is to be the advocate across government. And related to that, the Italians published my book, and only Italians would have a picture on the cover of me like that with the clicker in my hand and holding forth. I went to the Trento Festival of Economics, and I'd forgotten that the reason they'd invited me was that the theme of the Trento Festival of Economics was La Salute Disuguale. And I arrived in Trento and I saw all these big signs saying La Salute Disuguale, and I thought, that's the title of my book. And then there was a cardboard cutout of me. So I had a photo taken next to the cardboard cutout, and I sent it to my children, and one of my sons said he thought the cardboard looked better than the original. And a crossword of La Repubblica magazine, 146 down, British physician, founder of social epidemiology. It's in there. Anyway, Marmot. And I don't know, the president of the university is not here. I don't know whether I could put that on my curriculum vitae, that I was a clue in an Italian crossword puzzle. But it is a small indicator that people are listening. People are listening. We've been publishing regular reports on health and health inequalities and social determinants of health in the UK. And in 2017, I've updated it, we said that the rise in life expectancy had stalled. So this only goes back to the 1980s. In England, life expectancy increased about 1 year every 4 years from 1921 to 2011. So from the end of the First World War till 2011, life expectancy improved about 1 year every 4 years. Very similar in France. 1 year every 4 years, 6 hours every 24 hours. That means you come here at 9 o'clock, by 3 o'clock this afternoon, your life expectancy is long at 3 o'clock as it was at 9 o'clock in the morning. That's terrific. You get 6 hours for nothing. That's amazing. And then it stopped in 2011. You can imagine that the government was a bit sensitive. We had an election in 2010, and the following year, life expectancy stopped improving. Now, our government is not blessed with statisticians, but if they were, they would probably say correlation does not prove causation. So the fact that health stopped improving after we got elected, with policies of austerity to cut social services, to increase child poverty, doesn't prove that that was the cause. And I agree with them. It does not prove that that was the cause. But it's very worrying. This is a health crisis. If you watch the British Medical Journal, I've just written an editorial, which will be published quite soon, and I said that a health crisis is a social crisis. This is a health crisis. This is not an HIV or an Ebola epidemic, but this is a health crisis. Life expectancy had been improving for 90 years at the same rate and then stopped. Wow. And when we look at what's happened in the constituent countries of the United Kingdom, it more or less stopped improving in England, declined for men in Northern Ireland, declined for men and women in Scotland, declined for men and women in Wales. They're not huge declines, but it's not supposed to decline at all. It's supposed to get better year on year. And inequalities in life expectancy, this is, forgive me, the slope index of inequality, for males and females, the inequality is going up. So it stopped improving, and the inequality is going up. And I could show you, I haven't got the slide in here. For women, life expectancy is declining in the poorer parts of the population. And I ask, does the USA represent our future? What a thought. I put Trump and Brexit in the same category of utter disasters. Life expectancy in the US declined 2 years in a row. In fact, the news came out in November that life expectancy in the US declined 3 years in a row. And the big increase, unintentional injuries. Unintentional injuries include accidental drug overdoses, 63,600 deaths last year. In fact, now that I've updated it, it's 70,000 deaths due to accidental drug overdoses, opioids. And yes, you can blame Purdue Pharma, but deaths from opioid poisoning are not randomly distributed. The lower the years of education, the more deprived the population, the higher the mortality from poisonings, suicide, and alcohol. These are all psychosocially determined. And if you add in the US case to the 70,000 opioid poisonings, 32,000 deaths from firearms. That's 100,000 deaths a year that really should not occur. No wonder they're having challenges to their life expectancy. And I don't blame Trump for this. I blame this for Trump. In other words, in fact, there's good evidence. The areas with the highest mortality from drugs, alcohol, and suicide were the areas that were most likely to vote for Trump. In fact, people either committed suicide or voted for Trump. I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure in what order that happened. Vote for Trump and then commit suicide. And if we look at the social gradient in the US, this is life expectancy for men at age 50 by year of birth. So people who were born in 1920 will be 50 in 1970, and these are deciles of income. And you can see the social gradient. Parenthetically, because of the social gradient, is why when I opened the French Healthy Cities document, the first thing I saw was proportionate universalism. The only way to deal with the gradient is to have universalist policies with effort proportionate to need. So I thank the French Healthy Cities Network. And I've already said to Zoe that I'd like some good examples that I can put in my slides and show next time I give a talk. So there, there's the, can't go back. There's the gradient, year of birth 1920, and 30 years later, life expectancy has scarcely improved for the poorest 10% of men, improved a bit more for the next 10%, a bit more, a bit more, a bit more. So the gradient has got much steeper. The inequalities have got much bigger. Here we are in beautiful Marseille. I don't want to spoil your morning. I hope you're feeling strong and resilient before I show you the next slide. You ready for this? That's men. This is women. Life expectancy is going down for the bottom 10%. It's going down for the next 10%. It's going down for the next 10%. Life expectancy is declining for the bottom 30% of women. And it's going up quite nicely at the top. So the gradient has got much steeper, the inequalities have got much bigger, and life's got worse for the bottom 30%. And I say life has got worse. Length of life is shortened because quality of life has got worse. This is because of the social determinants of health, not simply lack of access to health care. And still sticking with the US, this is from UNICEF report card 14. Neonatal mortality, suicides aged 0 to 19, mental health of young people, drunkenness, 11 to 15, and, sorry, that's fertility, 15 to 19. So a measure of health of adolescents and young people. Portugal, wow, looks terrific. And there's the United States. So they're building up problems for the future. It's not just the 50-year-olds that are doing badly. The young people are doing badly. And so when I ask, is this our future? There's France, about average. And part of my argument is that the mind is an important gateway to health and health inequalities. Mental illness and well-being, we mustn't forget, and psychosocial pathways to physical illness. Impact on behaviors and stress pathways. When I say an important gateway, not the only gateway, we already heard this morning about air pollution and air quality, absolutely vital. I'll talk about cold and heat, but the mind is an important gateway. And we do not have to accept the magnitude of health inequalities. I've already showed you in the US and in the UK, health inequalities can increase over time. And they vary across countries. 15 European countries looking at life expectancy at 25 by education. ISC ED 0 to 2 is the international social classification of education. 0 to 2 is primary education. 5 to 6 is tertiary education. So in Sweden, they have long life expectancy at age 25 and a small gap between those with primary education and those with tertiary education. Italy, Norway, Malta, Denmark. When we go to Eastern Europe, Estonia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, low average and a huge gap between those with primary education and those with tertiary education. Putting it another way, the between-country differences are much smaller for those with university education. They do know how to get good health in Estonia and Bulgaria and Romania. Those with university education get good health. But the further east you go, the bigger the disadvantage of being born in Estonia or Hungary. Now, if you think that health is a matter of personal choice, if you are one of those politicians who say people only have themselves to blame, well, what a terrible choice to choose to be born in Hungary when you could have chosen to have a Norwegian mother and be born in Norway. You've only got yourself to blame for choosing to be born in Hungary. And if you're so stupid as to choose to be born in Hungary or Romania, make sure that you get a university education. And the way to do that is to have a parent with a university education. So it's up to you. Choose Norway, not Romania. Choose a university-educated parent, not a working-class parent. And then it's your problem. I want to make another point. So I'm talking about health inequalities, and I'm going to do something really dangerous. I'm going to ask you to keep a second idea in your head at the same time. I know it's complex, but you're Healthy Cities people. You can keep two ideas in your head at the same time. Growing up in Baltimore, I wrote about Baltimore in my book, The Health Gap. And if you live in Roland Park, a nice, green, wealthy area of Baltimore, life expectancy 83 for men, and you want to see what it's like to live somewhere where the life expectancy is 20 years shorter, you could fly to Ethiopia. Life expectancy 20 years shorter than in Roland Park. Or alternatively, you could go a few kilometers across town to Upton Druid, the poor part of Baltimore, where life expectancy is 63. And I don't want to go through all of this, but LaShawn, growing up in Upton Druid, single-parent families, median household income, $17,000. They do poorly in school. 90% did not go on to college. In the United States, if your parents are poor, you will be poor. The land of opportunity is a land of opportunity if your parents are rich. If your parents are poor, it is not a land of opportunity. And each year in Upton Druid, a third of young people aged 10 to 17 are arrested for a juvenile disorder. One third each year means the chance of getting to age 17 without a criminal record is quite small. So the second idea I want to introduce is not just inequalities in health, but inequalities in criminal activity. Or, more technically, inequalities in falling foul of the law, which is not entirely the same thing as indulging in criminal activity. And in fact, and each year, 2005 to 2009, 100 non-fatal shootings for every 10,000 residents and nearly 40 homicides. And in Roland Park, 93% two-parent families, whereas half were single-parent families in the poor part. Median income, not 17, but $90,000. Kids do well in school. 75% complete college. Juvenile arrests, 1 in 50, not 1 in 3. No non-fatal shootings and 4 homicides. Just before I published The Health Gap, there was civil unrest in Baltimore. There were riots. The precipitant of the civil unrest was the killing of a black man by the police. Or should I say, one more killing of a black man by the police. But the underlying cause was inequality. Because when I say Baltimore erupted, it wasn't Baltimore, it was Upton Druid, the poor part of Baltimore. And it's not just Baltimore. This is London. I've been showing this graph, life expectancy for men in Tottenham, 71 years, in Kensington and Chelsea, Queensgate Ward, 88 years. And you remember in 2011, we had summer riots in London. And the precipitant of the summer riots were the killing of a black man by the police. And where did the riots break out? No, not in Kensington and Chelsea. In Tottenham. I have one son who lives in Tottenham, by the way, because you can afford to buy housing in Tottenham. It's good to go where the riots are, because the housing's cheap. And 91% of the young people arrested in those Tottenham riots, 91% were not in employment, education, or training. In Kensington and Chelsea, everybody is in employment, education, or training. But 91%, the national figure was 11% not in employment, education, or training. People who have a stake in the future don't riot, and they don't get arrested. Trainee lawyers and accountants and business people and doctors, they don't get arrested by the police in civil unrest. It's people who've got no stake in the future, nothing to look forward to. And thinking about this crime-health link, I've become something of an advocate for health of Indigenous people. In Australia, the life expectancy gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, 10.6 years for men, 9.4 years for women. And last year, in fact, exactly 12 months ago, I went to Alice Springs in Central Australia. And then they took me to Arayonga, 2 hours drive from Alice Springs in the red heart of Australia. A tiny place, got 3 buildings, a council office, a health clinic and a store. Parenthetically, when we went to the health clinic, they showed me proudly the health promotion advice. Eat fruit and vegetables to prevent obesity. Fruit and vegetables? We're in the middle of the desert. Do you know how much an apple costs in Alice Springs? And we're 2 hours drive from Alice Springs. And these people have no economic activity at all. And they're supposed to eat fruit and vegetables. You've only got yourself to blame if you don't follow the healthy eating advice. In Alice Springs, the largest building is the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory. This huge building that looms over the whole town of Alice Springs. Justice. And this is what justice means in the Northern Territory of Australia. The incarceration rate for Indigenous Australians is 2,400 per 100,000. For the non-Indigenous, it's 186, a 13-fold difference. 84% of the prison population is Indigenous compared to 27% of the general population. And 72% of the male prisoners have a diagnosed mental illness, and 92% of the female prisoners have a diagnosed mental illness. Can you think of a worse place to put damaged young people than in prison? We find somebody with mental illness and we put them in prison. And then we wonder why the suicide rate is so high in prisons. They call them death in custody. It's often unclear whether they've been killed by the prison guards or they killed themselves, and sometimes it's a bit of both. A health crisis is a social crisis, and it translates into incarceration. Just while I'm on the topic, the incarceration rate in Japan is 48 per 100,000. In the UK, it's 148 per 100,000. And in the US, it's 700 per 100,000. And you know who's there? Young black men. I had a quick look. I'm not an expert in this. I found some data from Denmark. Violent offending, 10% of males, 26% of females have a mental illness. UK estimate, 80% of all criminal activity attributable to people who had conduct problems in childhood and adolescence. So I don't know whether the right figure is 10% or 80%, but it's a lot. Somewhere between 10 and 80% of prisoners have a diagnosed mental illness. Therefore, prevent mental illness in children. So my 2 ideas that I asked you to keep in mind are really one idea. Invest in preventing mental illness in children, and you'll reduce crime rates as well as improving health and promoting health equity. So how do we do it? As you heard in the introduction, I got an award in Geneva, the World Health Assembly, on Monday. for doing these things. I chaired the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, and we called our report Closing the Gap in a Generation. And we said on the cover of our report, social injustice is killing on a grand scale. I was then asked by the British government, how could we translate the findings of your global commission for one country, England? And I called my report Fair Society, Healthy Lives. The Marmot Review, and I'll come back to the Marmot cities, and then the European Review of Social Determinants and the Health Divide. And we're just we published the executive summary last year, and the full report will be published at the Directing Council of the Pan American Health Organization, the Commission of the Pan American Health Organization on Equity and Health Inequalities in the Americas. And we've called our report Just Societies, Health Equity and Dignified Lives. The idea being that we need to take the action to enable people to lead dignified lives, and that will improve health and promote health equity. So the 6 domains of recommendations from my English review: give every child the best start in life, education and lifelong learning, employment and working conditions. Number 4, having enough money to live on. It's quite helpful if you haven't got any money to have a bit more money so you can live. Number 5, which is very close to everything you do, create healthy and sustainable places in which to live and work. And number 6, taking a social determinants approach to prevention, not just telling people not to smoke or to be physically active, but to deal with the social drivers of those healthy and unhealthy behaviors. So, early child development, an example from our American review. Look at the proportion of children enrolled in preschool. In Cuba, 100% of 3 to 5-year-olds are enrolled in preschool. Costa Rica, Chile, high proportion. The other end, Paraguay, Dominican Republic, Colombia, low proportions enrolled in preschool. Now look at reading scores in the 6th grade. It exactly parallels the proportion enrolled in preschool. And Cuba, Costa Rica, and Chile have the longest life expectancy in the Americas. And Paraguay, Dominican Republic, and Colombia have among the shortest. Now, that's not proof, but it's consistent with a model of saying invest in early child development, enroll children in preschool, you get better performance in the school system. People then become more responsible citizens, get better jobs, have more income, less inequality, and better health. And it starts in early childhood. Costa Rica, Cuba, and Chile have longer life expectancy for men than in the United States. The US has a gross national income per person of $60,000, and adjusting for purchasing power, in Costa Rica, it's $17,000, and longer life expectancy. So when my recommendation 4 was having enough money to live on, for a country, it needs to have enough money, but when it gets to around $17,000 per person, adjusting for purchasing power, that seems to be enough to provide the basics. Getting richer is not the solution to getting healthier for a country. Investing in the social determinants of health is the way forward. So sticking with early childhood and looking back at report card 14, this is comparing child poverty in different countries, and it's a relative measure. Child poverty is defined as less than 60% median income. So in Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Finland, Republic of Korea, child poverty is 9, 10, 10.5, 11%. In France, it's, I saw France, there we are. It's 17.7%. Not as good as the Nordic countries. Better than in the UK, 19.7%. And in the US, it's 29%, just below Mexico. I was giving a lecture at Harvard a couple of weeks ago, and I looked at the audience and said, "You live in a democracy. This must be the level of child poverty that you want. Otherwise, you'd elect a government that did something different." Well, there probably is not a single person in Boston who voted for Trump, so it makes them feel very uncomfortable. But this isn't Trump. This was Obama, these figures. And child poverty can't be controlled by the city. It can be controlled by the Minister of Finance, who's got his hand on the lever. He could reduce child poverty tomorrow by making adjustments to the tax and benefit system. This is a political choice. So what you do at the city level is absolutely vital, but it's set in the context of decisions that are being taken at the national level, like child poverty. And that is a key driver of early child development. What about housing and neighborhoods? In London, 17% of children are growing up in poverty, less than 60% median income. After you take housing costs into account, 17% becomes 37%. Housing is a cause of poverty. Poverty is a cause of bad housing. I'm no economist, but I think there's something about supply and demand. If you haven't got a supply of decent housing, the price goes up. And then people can't have decent housing. We did a report on the impact of cold housing, cold homes and fuel poverty. And growing up in a cold home impacts on mortality, morbidity, and other social impacts. More than 1 in 4 adolescents living in cold housing are at risk of multiple mental health problems, compared to 1 in 20 of adolescents in warm housing. Cold housing is damaging children's mental health. And cold housing negatively affects children's educational attainment, emotional well-being, and resilience. I spent a year as president of the British Medical Association, and the chairman, the political head, was from Scotland, from Edinburgh. And when we produced our report on cold housing, he said, "Oh, you can't tell me that that damages children's mental performance. Why, when I was a boy in Scotland, we had ice on the inside of the windows." And I said, "Hamish, imagine what you might have achieved if you'd grown up in a warm home." And we've had a big decline in social housing. This is the percent of homes not meeting decent home standards by region and tenure, privately rented and social housing. The quality of housing in the private rental sector is much worse on average in every region than in social housing. And we had this big decline in London. 38% of people were living in social housing, and then Margaret Thatcher sold off the social housing. Now 23% live in social housing, and 37% of children are growing up in poverty because of housing costs. And use of green space, the more deprived the area, the less the use of green space. So it's quality of housing, quality of neighborhood, and that relates to deprivation. What about climate change? These are French data, comes from INSERM. The impact of the heat wave in Europe in 2003, the estimate was 14,000 excess deaths in France. This is over and above what would normally be expected for the month of August. 7,000 in Germany, Spain, Italy, UK. So climate change is going to make the problems of deprivation and health worse. Cold homes and heat, both a problem. Let me come back to the theme of poor people only have themselves to blame. We recommend healthy eating. If people in the bottom 10% of household income in England followed the healthy eating advice, they would spend 74% of household income on food. If they eat healthy food, how can they pay the rent? If they pay the rent, how can they eat? If they eat, how can they heat? But the good news, Coventry is a Marmot city. The city of Coventry took my 6 recommendations and said, that's going to be our planning for the future. In fact, they told me recently, Coventry's been declared the European City of Culture for 2021. And they claim that it's because they're a Marmot city. I said, oh, come on, I don't believe that. They said, yeah, when we made the bid to become European City of Culture, it was because we've got principles of equity and solidarity across all the domains of the city that was attractive. We just started working with Greater Manchester. They want to make Manchester a Marmot region. And the same principles of taking my 6 domains of recommendations and making that the basis for the reform of public services in Greater Manchester. I was invited to Trieste. They said it was an Italian Marmot city. When I got there, I said, did the people of Trieste know that they're a Marmot city? No, of course not. We only said that to invite you here. And when I went to Bologna, I had the same conversation. They invited me to Bologna because they said it was an Italian Marmot city. When I got to Bologna and said, are you a Marmot city? They said, what? No, no. We just said that to get you to agree to come. But if we declare ourselves a Marmot city, will you come back? I said, I'll come back. But the idea, though, is they're taking those 6 domains of recommendations and applying them in a practical way at the city level. To come back to Indigenous Australians, I mentioned the low level of life expectancy, and one of the problems is suicide, particularly in Aboriginal men. And I was taken to a place called The Shed, and it is a shed in Western Sydney. And it was set up to prevent Aboriginal male suicide. And the people who set this place up, they said the conventional wisdom is that men get depressed because they won't talk about their feelings. We took the view, they told me, that men get depressed because they have their children taken away from them, because they're socially isolated, because they're unemployed, because they're poor, because they're homeless. And they get depressed and they kill themselves. and I met these Aboriginal men, and I was hearing one story after another of child removal, social isolation, unemployment. So the shed is set up, and they get social services and legal services to try and deal with the social determinants of Aboriginal male suicide. Great problems, but it's inspiring to see these people making a difference. And this Aboriginal man is an inspiration, a power of nature, who's just involved. He won't let go. He gets the legal people, he gets the housing people, he gets the employment people. He won't let go. He's just working on behalf of his community. Absolutely inspiring. And we already have a network set up, ready to go, when we launch our PAHO Commission, the Health Equity Network in the Americas. So we've got partners all throughout the Americas who want to get active on social determinants of health. I've said that my two messages in a world of post-fact politics is evidence-based policy presented in a spirit of social justice. We need the evidence and we need the commitment to social justice. Remember, we said on the cover of our WHO Commission report, social injustice is killing on a grand scale. And I'll do the unpardonable and quote myself. At the end of our PAHO Commission report, we said, at the heart of the Commission's purpose is ensuring the right of all people in the Americas to lead lives of dignity and enjoy the highest attainable standard of health. We call on all governments to act. Thank you.